The sun rose over the Virginia plantation like it always did, indifferent, relentless, burning. The cotton fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, white bowls waiting to be picked by hands that had picked them 1,000 times before. Elijah stood at the edge of the field, his back scarred into a map of suffering, his eyes fixed on something far beyond what anyone else could see. He was 28 years old, though he looked older. The plantation had aged him in ways that years alone could not. His hands were calloused, his shoulders broad from years of forced labor, but it was his eyes that people noticed. Dark, steady, and carrying something that made even the overseers uncomfortable, a quiet strength, a waiting. Colonel Marcus Whitfield owned the plantation. He was a tall man with a permanent sneer, dressed always in fine clothes that contrasted sharply with the rags worn by those he enslaved. He ruled through fear, through violence, through a cruelty so methodical it felt like policy. The whip was his language. Blood was his punctuation. Elijah had been born on this land. His mother had died here when he was 12, collapsing in the fields under a sun that showed no mercy. His father had been sold away when Elijah was just a boy, dragged off in chains while Elijah screamed himself hoarse. The plantation had taken everything from him, piece by piece, year by year. But Elijah had survived. He'd learned to make himself small, to keep his head down, to endure. He'd watched others try to resist and seen what happened to them, the whipping post, the iron collar, the long night screams that echoed from the overseer's cabin. He'd learned that survival meant silence, until today. The morning had started like any other. Roll call at dawn, distribution of work assignments, the crack of the whip to motivate those who moved too slowly. Elijah had taken his basket and headed to his section of the field, his mind already numb to the routine. But then he heard the screaming. It came from near the main house, a woman's voice, high and desperate, followed by children crying. Elijah's hands froze on the cotton plant. Around him, others stopped too, their faces turning toward the sound with the practiced wariness of people who'd learned that curiosity could get you killed. "Keep working," an overseer shouted, his horse moving between the rows. "Ain't none of your concern." But Elijah couldn't look away. Through the gap between the slave quarters and the main house, he could see them, a family he knew. Samuel, his wife Ruth, and their 2 children. They'd been caught trying to escape 3 days ago, dragged back in chains, locked in the punishment shed. Now they stood in the yard, and Colonel Whitfield stood before them with his pistol drawn. "Let this be a lesson," the colonel's voice carried across the morning air, cold and clear. "To every one of you who thinks about running, to every one of you who forgets your place." The first shot rang out before Elijah could process what was happening. Samuel fell. Ruth screamed and threw herself over him, and the second shot silenced her scream forever. The children, no more than 6 and 8 years old, clung to each other crying, and Whitfield raised his pistol again. Something inside Elijah shattered, not broke, shattered. Like glass hit by a hammer, like ice cracking under unbearable weight. The numbness that had protected him for years, the silence that had kept him alive, the careful control that had made survival possible, all of it exploded into fragments. His hands shook, his vision narrowed, his heart hammered in his chest so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. The third and fourth shots echoed across the plantation. Silence fell, heavy, suffocating. The kind of silence that follows unspeakable things. Whitfield holstered his pistol and turned back toward the house, wiping his hands on a cloth as if he'd just finished an unpleasant chore. The overseers began barking orders, forcing everyone back to work, but Elijah couldn't move. He stood there, cotton forgotten in his hands, staring at the 4 bodies lying in the dirt. He'd seen death before. He'd witnessed beatings, hangings, brandings. He'd held people as they died from infections, exhaustion, despair, but something about this moment, The casual efficiency of it, the complete absence of hesitation, the way Whitfield had killed an entire family like someone swatting flies, burned itself into Elijah's mind. That night, when the work finally ended and the enslaved were herded back to their quarters, Elijah didn't sleep. He sat on the dirt floor of the cabin he shared with 15 others, his back against the rough wood wall, and felt something new growing inside him. Not just anger, not just pain. Something colder, something sharper. Purpose. Around him, people whispered in the darkness. He heard their fear, their grief, their exhaustion. He heard old Moses praying quietly in the corner. He heard Sarah crying softly for the children she'd never see grow up. He heard the sound of chains, always chains, rattling as someone shifted in their sleep. And he made a decision. He didn't know exactly what yet. He didn't have a plan. But he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't live like this anymore. That survival without dignity wasn't survival at all. That some things were worth dying for. The colonel had made his last mistake today. He'd shown Elijah exactly what kind of monster he was. And monsters, Elijah knew, could bleed just like anyone else. As the moon rose high over the plantation, casting silver light through the cracks in the cabin walls, Elijah closed his eyes and whispered a promise to himself, to his mother, to his father, to Samuel and Ruth and their children. This wouldn't stand. If you want to discover what happens next, don't forget to like and follow the channel so you won't miss the upcoming chapters. 3 weeks passed, and Elijah watched everything. He watched how the overseers moved through the plantation, their patterns and routines. He watched when Whitfield took his evening walks, always alone, always armed. He watched the gates, the fences, the roads that led away from this place. He watched with the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing meant dying. But inside, something was building. Every morning when the bell rang, every time the whip cracked, every night when he heard someone crying in the darkness. The rage grew, but so did something else, a strange, cold clarity. The plantation operated like clockwork. Whitfield prided himself on efficiency. 287 people enslaved on his land, each one assigned a role, a quota, a purpose. The cotton had to be picked, the tobacco had to be cured, the colonel's wealth had to grow. Elijah had been assigned to the fields, but sometimes he was called to work in the storage barn, organizing supplies, moving heavy loads. It was during one of these assignments that he found it, the overseer's spare rifle, hidden behind grain sacks, covered in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. His hands trembled as he touched it. He'd never held a gun before. Enslaved people caught with weapons were tortured to death, their bodies displayed as warnings. But Elijah lifted it anyway, felt its weight, memorized where it was hidden. He didn't take it, not yet. But knowing it was there changed something. That same week, he started talking to people, carefully, quietly. Not about rebellion, you couldn't say that word without inviting death, but about freedom, about the North, about what they'd heard, what they dreamed of, what they were willing to risk. Old Moses, who'd been enslaved for 63 years, shook his head. Freedom's a dream, boy. Dreams get you killed. But Sarah, who'd lost 3 children to the auction block, looked at him with hollow eyes and said, "If there's a chance, any chance, I'll take it." Young Thomas, barely 16, whispered in the darkness, "I heard there's paths through the swamps. Places the dogs can't track, people who'll help if you can make it far enough." Elijah absorbed every piece of information. He mapped it in his mind. The swamps to the east, the river to the north, the roads the slave catchers used, the safe houses he'd heard whispers about but never seen. But the real breaking point came on a Wednesday morning in late September. The colonel had purchased new enslaved people at auction, 15 men, women and children brought in chains from the coast. They were terrified, separated from families, speaking different languages, crying openly. Whitfield stood on his porch, watching them being processed like cattle, taking inventory. One of the new arrivals, a young woman no more than 20, stumbled getting off the wagon. Her chains caught, and she fell hard, landing on her hands and knees in the dirt. The overseer nearest to her, a man named Pike, known for his cruelty, kicked her in the ribs. "Get up, you lazy—" Elijah didn't think. His body moved before his mind could stop it. He stepped forward, put himself between Pike and the fallen woman, and met the overseer's eyes directly. "She just fell," Elijah said quietly. "She's getting up." The world seemed to stop. Everyone within sight froze. An enslaved person didn't contradict an overseer, didn't speak out of turn, didn't meet their eyes. Pike's face went red. His hand moved to his whip. "What did you say, boy?" Elijah held his ground. His heart hammered, but his voice stayed steady. "She's getting up, sir. No need for—" The whip cracked across his face. Pain exploded through his cheek, warm blood running down to his jaw. Pike struck him again and again, forcing Elijah to his knees. But even as he fell, even as the leather cut into his skin, Elijah kept his eyes open. He looked up at the porch and saw Colonel Whitfield watching, smiling. That smile, that casual, amused smile, as Elijah bled in the dirt, that's what did it. That night, after the doctor, such as he was, had sewn up the worst of the gashes on Elijah's face, after the other enslaved people had helped him back to the cabin, after the pain had settled into a throbbing ache, Elijah sat in the darkness and made his final decision. He couldn't wait anymore, couldn't plan anymore, couldn't watch anymore. "I'm leaving," he whispered to the darkness. Around him, breathing paused. Someone shifted. Sarah's voice came from across the cabin. "When?" "Soon, maybe a week, maybe less." "They'll kill you," Moses said. "They always kill runners." "Then I'll die free," Elijah replied, "or trying to be." Silence fell again, but it was different now, charged, expectant. Then Thomas spoke up. "How many can you take with you?" Elijah turned toward the young man's voice. "What? If you're going," Thomas said, "how many of us can you take?" "Thomas, that's—" Moses started. "I'm going too," Sarah interrupted. "If Elijah's going, I'm going." "And me," someone else said. Then another, then another. Within minutes, whispers were spreading through the cabin, through the adjacent cabins, moving like wildfire through dry grass. People who'd given up hope years ago suddenly felt it flickering again. People who'd accepted their fate suddenly questioned it. Elijah felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. He'd thought about saving himself, maybe grabbing a few trusted people, but this was something else entirely. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we have to do it right. We need supplies, routes, timing, and we need everyone to commit. Because if even one person talks, we all die." "We're already dead," Sarah said quietly. "We're just waiting for it. At least this way we choose when and how." Over the next 4 days, Elijah organized what would become the largest escape attempt in Virginia's history. He didn't plan it that way. It just grew. Word spread from cabin to cabin, whispered in the fields, passed along during the brief moments when the overseers weren't watching. He divided people into groups, assigned leaders, mapped routes, gathered supplies, stolen blankets, food hidden in false-bottom baskets, knives taken from the kitchen. He memorized the patrol schedules, the locations of hunting dogs, the times when changing shifts left gaps in surveillance, and he retrieved the rifle from the barn. On the 5th night, when the moon was just a sliver in the sky, Elijah stood at the edge of the slave quarters and counted 287 people total on the plantation. He'd thought maybe 50 would be willing to risk it. But when he looked out at the darkness and saw the shadows gathering, saw the faces turned toward him with desperate hope, he realized the number was much higher. Nearly 300 people ready to run, ready to risk everything, ready to follow him into the unknown. If this story is gripping you, go ahead and like it and follow the channel so you don't miss any of this adventure. The signal came at midnight, 3 soft bird calls that Elijah had taught the group leaders. One by one, cabin doors opened silently, shadows slipped into the darkness. Families held hands, parents carried children, the old helped the young. Elijah stood near the main barn, watching his people gather in the designated assembly points. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. 300 lives depended on what happened in the next few hours. But before they could run, before they could vanish into the swamps and toward freedom, there was something Elijah needed to do. He gripped the rifle in his hands and turned toward the main house. "Wait here," he told Thomas, who'd become his second in command. "Give me 10 minutes. If I don't come back, start moving people out. Don't wait for me." "Elijah, don't wait for me," he repeated, and moved toward the house before Thomas could argue. The colonel's mansion stood 3 stories tall, white columns gleaming in the starlight. Elijah had been inside only a handful of times, always to carry supplies, always supervised, always reminded of his place. Now he approached it differently, not as property, not as the enslaved, as someone who'd finally found his power. The side door was unlocked. The colonel's arrogance assumed no one would dare enter uninvited. Elijah slipped inside, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. The house smelled of tobacco smoke and brandy. Wealth, comfort, all of it built on stolen lives. He found Whitfield in his study, exactly where Elijah knew he'd be. The colonel sat in a leather chair, a glass of whiskey in one hand, ledgers spread before him, counting his money, calculating his worth in human suffering. Elijah raised the rifle. The floorboard creaked. Whitfield's head snapped up, his hand moving toward the pistol on his desk, but he froze when he saw Elijah standing in the doorway, the rifle aimed directly at his chest. "You!" Whitfield said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. "Elijah, isn't it? The one Pike whipped last week." "Yes, sir," Elijah said quietly. The honorific came automatically, years of conditioning, but this time it tasted like poison. "Put the gun down, boy. You know what happens to—" "Samuel," Elijah interrupted. "Ruth, their children, you remember their names?" Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "That was 3 weeks ago. They tried to run, had to make an example. They were human beings. They were property." Whitfield's hand inched toward his pistol. "As are you, and when I'm done with you, your punishment will make theirs look merciful. Now put down the—" The rifle fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Whitfield jerked backward, his chair toppling, the glass of whiskey shattering on the floor. He clutched his shoulder, blood spreading through his fine white shirt, his face twisted in shock and pain. Elijah worked the bolt action, chambering another round, his hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He walked closer, standing over the man who'd owned him, beaten him, broken him for 28 years. "You think you can—" Whitfield gasped. "They'll hunt you down, hang you, burn you alive, every one of you." "Maybe," Elijah said, "but you won't see it." He raised the rifle again, but then paused. Killing Whitfield would be easy, quick, but something occurred to Elijah, something more fitting, more symbolic. He set the rifle aside and drew the knife he'd taken from the kitchen. Whitfield's eyes went wide with fear, real fear, perhaps the first time he'd felt it in years. "What are you—" "You took everything from me," Elijah said quietly, kneeling beside him. "My mother, my father, my childhood, my dignity. You treated us like animals, beat us, killed us, and you never thought about consequences." The knife flashed in the lamplight. What Elijah did next was brutal, primal, years of rage and pain channeled into a single act of vengeance. He didn't just kill the colonel, he took from him what the colonel had taken from so many: his identity, his power, his very sense of self. When it was over, when Whitfield's screams had faded to silence, Elijah stood. His hands were covered in blood, his chest heaved. He felt hollow and full at the same time, empty of the rage that had sustained him, filled with something he couldn't quite name. Justice, revenge, freedom, all of them. None of them. He grabbed the colonel's pistol, stuffed it in his belt, and ran. Outside, chaos had erupted. The gunshot had woken the overseers. Dogs were barking. Lanterns were being lit. Elijah sprinted across the yard toward where his people waited in the darkness. "Move!" he shouted. "Now! Go!" Thomas had organized them well. The 300 began moving in groups, spreading out toward different routes like water-finding cracks. Some headed for the swamps, others toward the river, still others into the dense forest. Pike appeared from the overseer's quarters, pulling on his pants, reaching for his rifle. Elijah didn't hesitate. He raised the colonel's pistol and fired. Pike went down screaming, clutching his leg. "Keep moving!" Elijah shouted. "Don't stop! Follow the leaders!" More overseers were coming now. Gunshots rang out. Someone screamed. Elijah saw one of his people, a young man named Isaac, fall, clutching his back. Sarah grabbed him, helped him up, kept moving. The plantation had become a war zone, 300 people running in every direction, overseers firing blindly into the darkness, dogs released, baying for blood. Chaos. Beautiful, terrible chaos. Elijah led the largest group toward the eastern swamp, the route he'd studied most carefully. Behind them, the plantation burned. Someone had set fire to the cotton stores, the barn, spreading flames that lit up the night sky. They plunged into the swamp, mud sucking at their feet, water rising to their knees. The cold was shocking, but they pushed forward. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit, men on horses, dogs howling, gunshots echoing through the trees. But Elijah had chosen this route carefully. The swamp was treacherous for those who didn't know it. Horses couldn't follow easily. Dogs lost scent in the water. And the enslaved people who'd spent their lives adapting to survive, who'd learned every trick and skill necessary to endure, knew how to disappear. They moved through the night like ghosts, helping each other, carrying children, supporting the weak. When dawn broke, they were deep in the swamp, miles from the plantation, exhausted but free. Free. Elijah looked back at the 300 faces surrounding him, scared, hopeful, determined, and felt the weight of what they'd done settle on his shoulders. They'd burned it all down, the plantation, their chains, their past. Now came the hard part, staying alive. And if you want to keep discovering what happens, follow the channel now. Every chapter brings new revelations. The first 3 days were the hardest. 300 people moving through hostile territory, leaving trails despite their best efforts, hunted by men with dogs and guns, and generations of practice tracking runaways. Elijah split them into smaller groups, each taking different routes toward the north, toward rumored safe houses and sympathetic souls. But staying together or apart, the challenges were the same: food, water, avoiding capture, and the constant gnawing fear that every sound was a pursuer closing in. They traveled at night, hid during the day. They ate wild plants that the older folks recognized, drank from streams, huddled together for warmth. Children cried, and parents comforted them with whispered lullabies. The old struggled and the young carried them. It was beautiful and brutal all at once. On the 4th day, the hunters caught up to one of the groups. Elijah heard the gunshots echoing through the forest, distant but unmistakable. His stomach turned. Thomas looked at him with wide eyes, waiting for orders. "Keep moving," Elijah said, though every instinct screamed at him to go back, to help. "We can't save them by getting caught ourselves." But that night, as they rested in a ravine, survivors from the attacked group found them. 12 people, terrified and traumatized. They'd lost 9 in the ambush, shot, captured or drowned trying to escape across a river. "The slave catchers are everywhere," a woman named Grace gasped, still dripping wet. "They've got posses coming from 3 counties, rewards posted. Every white man with a gun is hunting us." Elijah listened to her report with a sinking feeling. 300 people couldn't hide. The logistics were impossible. They were leaving too many traces, footprints, broken branches, campsites that couldn't be completely concealed. "We need to split up more," he said. "Groups no bigger than 10, separate completely, travel different routes, meet at..." "No." Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm despite the exhaustion on her face. We stay together. That's our strength. Alone, they'll pick us off one by one. Together, we protect each other. Together, we're easier to track, but harder to break. They argued through the night, voices kept low, but emotions running high. Some wanted to scatter completely, others wanted to turn back, take their chances surrendering. Still others wanted to find weapons, fight back. Elijah felt the leadership crushing down on him. Every decision meant lives. Every choice had consequences. He'd never asked for this responsibility, never wanted to decide who lived and died. But he'd started this. He'd killed the colonel. He'd freed these people. And now he had to see it through. We keep moving north, he finally decided. Groups of 20 now instead of 50. Stagger our travel by hours. But we follow the same general route, and we help any group that gets in trouble. It wasn't perfect. It probably wouldn't work, but it was something. Over the following week, their numbers decreased. Not all from capture or death. Some people chose different paths, different risks. A group of 15 split off to head west instead of north, hoping to find shelter in territories where slavery was less entrenched. Another 20 decided to hide in the mountains to build a community far from civilization. Elijah couldn't blame them. The journey was taking its toll, feet bleeding from walking barefoot through rough terrain, infections setting in from untreated wounds, hunger weakening everyone, the constant fear eating away at hope. But the worst moment came on the 9th day. They'd been following a creek through dense forest when they stumbled upon a small settlement, a handful of cabins tucked into a valley. Smoke rose from chimneys, clothes hung on lines. It looked peaceful, almost inviting. Could be friendly, Thomas suggested hopefully. Could be abolitionists, or could be a trap, Grace countered. Elijah studied the settlement through the trees. They desperately needed supplies, food, medicine. Information about routes north, but approaching was a risk, one that could end with all of them in chains again. He made a decision that still haunts him. I'll go alone, he said. If it's safe, I'll signal. If it's not, scatter and keep moving. He approached the first cabin carefully, hands visible, posture non-threatening. A woman came to the door. Middle-aged, tired-looking, her dress worn but clean. She saw Elijah and her eyes widened. Please, he said quietly. We need help. Food, directions, anything you can spare. We have children with us, old people. We've been traveling for... The woman's face changed, not to kindness, to calculation, to greed. How many of you? She asked. Elijah's instinct screamed danger, but he was so tired, so desperate. About 40 in my group, more scattered in the area, she smiled. Wait here. She closed the door. Elijah realized his mistake immediately. He turned to run, to warn the others, but it was too late. Men emerged from the other cabins, armed, organized, clearly waiting. Slave catchers. The whole settlement was a trap. Got a live one, someone shouted. And he says there's 40 more. Gunshots rang out. Elijah ran, zigzagging through the trees as bullets whipped past him. Behind him he heard pursuit, horses, dogs, men who knew these woods better than he did. He led them away from his group deliberately, making himself the target, giving the others time to escape. Branches tore at his clothes and skin, his lungs burned, his legs cramped, but he kept running. A bullet grazed his side, spinning him around, sending him crashing down a slope. He rolled, tumbled, felt ribs crack, tasted blood. When he stopped, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only lie there as the hunters closed in. They surrounded him, 5 men on horses, dogs snapping and snarling. One dismounted, kicked Elijah in the ribs where the bullet had grazed, making him cry out. You the one who killed Colonel Whitfield? The man asked. Elijah coughed blood, couldn't answer. Don't matter. Dead or alive, there's $1,000 reward on your head, and we aim to collect. They tied him with ropes so tight it cut into his wrists. tied him to a horse, started dragging him back toward the settlement, not caring when he stumbled, when he fell, when the rope burned through his skin. This was the end, Elijah thought through the haze of pain. He'd tried. He'd failed. At least some of his people had escaped. At least he'd hurt Whitfield before. The first gunshot came from the trees. One of the slave catchers fell from his horse. The others spun, reaching for weapons, but more shots rang out. Deliberate, accurate, deadly. 3 more men went down. The last catcher tried to run, but someone tackled him from behind. When Elijah managed to focus his eyes, he saw Thomas standing over the man, holding a captured rifle. "Thought we'd let you face this alone?" Thomas said, helping Elijah to his feet. "We're in this together, remember?" Around them, 40 people emerged from hiding. The group Elijah had tried to protect. They'd circled back, armed themselves with the captured weapons, and saved him. "How did you?" Elijah started. "We learned from you," Sarah said, cutting the ropes from his wrists. "We fight back now." They left the slave catchers tied up, took their weapons and supplies, and disappeared into the forest again. But something had changed. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting, surviving, becoming something more than escaped slaves. They were becoming free people. And if you're curious about the conclusion of this story, don't forget to like and enable notifications for the channel to follow the final chapter. 53 days after the escape began, Elijah stood on the bank of the Ohio River. Behind him, 187 people. Out of 300 who'd run from the plantation, this many had made it. Some had been captured. Others had died from injuries, illness, or exhaustion. Still others had chosen different paths, scattered across the South in a dozen different directions. But these 187 had stayed together, had fought together, had survived together. The river stretched before them, wide and dark, the border between slavery and something else, not quite freedom. The laws still said they were property, hunters still tracked them, danger still waited, but it was a border nonetheless, a line they could cross. "Is it over?" a young girl asked her mother, staring at the water. "No, baby," the woman replied softly. "But it's different now. We're different now." Elijah looked at the faces around him, scarred, exhausted, but unbroken. Sarah stood nearby, holding the hands of 2 children who weren't hers, but who'd lost their parents on the journey. Thomas had his arm around Grace, the two having found something like love in the midst of terror. Old Moses, who'd said freedom was a dream that got you killed, stood tall despite his years, tears streaming down his weathered face. They'd paid for this moment in blood and pain. They'd lost people they loved. They'd done things they'd never imagined themselves capable of. Killed, stolen, lied, fought. They'd been forced to become harder, colder, more ruthless than they'd ever wanted to be. But they'd made it. Over the next week, they crossed the river in small groups, helped by sympathetic allies who operated safe houses. They dispersed into different communities, some staying together, others seeking long-lost family, still others pushing further north toward Canada, where the laws couldn't reach them. Elijah himself stayed near the river for months, helping other refugees make the crossing. Word of the Virginia plantation escape had spread through the underground networks like wildfire. 300 people running at once, the largest organized escape attempt in decades. It inspired others, gave them hope, showed them resistance was possible. The story got bigger with each telling. Some said Elijah had killed 10 men with his bare hands. Others claimed he'd burned the entire plantation to ashes. Hundreds of buildings turned to smoke. The truth was messy, complicated, less dramatic than the legend. But the legend mattered. The legend gave people courage. One night, about a year after the escape, Elijah sat by a fire in Ohio, surrounded by a new group of refugees he'd helped guide north. A young man asked him about the plantation, about Colonel Whitfield, about what really happened that night. Elijah was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames, remembering things he wished he could forget. The colonel thought we were property, he finally said. Things he owned, things without souls or thoughts or feelings. And for a long time, I almost believed him, because believing otherwise hurt too much, because hope is dangerous when you have none. He touched his face, tracing the scars Pike's whip had left, still visible after all these months. But then I realized something. He needed us to believe we were property more than we needed to believe it. His whole world depended on us accepting the chains, and the moment we stopped accepting them, his power disappeared. So what happened? The young man pressed. When you confronted him? Elijah met his eyes. I reminded him that monsters bleed too, that cruelty has consequences, that people push too far will eventually push back. He didn't tell them the details, didn't describe the scalping, the blood, the look in Whitfield's eyes as he realized he was dying. Some things didn't need to be passed on. Some memories were his burden alone to carry. And after? Someone else asked. After you killed him? Was it worth it? Elijah considered the question, really considered it. Was it worth it? The deaths during the escape, the people captured and returned to slavery, probably punished worse than ever. The constant running, the permanent fear, the knowledge that he could never truly be safe. He looked around the fire at the faces watching him, free faces, scarred and tired but their own, making their own choices, living their own lives. Yes, he said simply. Yes, it was worth it. Years later, long after Elijah had settled in Canada, long after he'd married and had children of his own, long after the Civil War had ended and slavery was officially abolished, someone asked him what he wanted to be remembered for. He thought about the plantation, about the colonel, about the 300 people who ran into the night with nothing but hope and desperation, about the 187 who made it across the river, about the ones who didn't. I want people to remember that we fought back, he said, that we weren't passive victims waiting for someone else to save us, that we took our freedom even when it seemed impossible, that we paid for it in blood and tears, but we paid because it mattered. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. And I want them to remember that cruelty always has a price, that oppressors always fall, that people pushed to their breaking point will break, but not in the way their oppressors expect. They'll break free. The story of the Virginia plantation escape became legend in abolitionist circles. It was whispered in slave quarters across the South, giving people courage. It was told in free states as proof that resistance was possible. It was recorded in newspapers, books, histories, sometimes accurate, often embellished, always powerful. But the truth, as Elijah knew, was simpler and more complex than any legend could capture. 300 people had run because they'd had enough. Because one man's rage at injustice had sparked something in others. Because sometimes survival means risking everything. Because freedom, even if you die seeking it, is worth more than safety in chains. And on a September night in 1703, on a Virginia plantation that no longer exists, Colonel Marcus Whitfield learned that lesson too late. His cruelty had created the very thing he feared most, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. In the end, it wasn't the number of people freed that mattered most. It was the act of freeing them, the demonstration that chains could be broken, that oppressors could be defeated, that the impossible was only impossible until someone did it. Elijah died in 1782, an old man surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd never worn chains. His last words were simple, whispered to a grandson who asked what freedom meant. Freedom means you get to choose your own scars. And somewhere in the soil, where a plantation once stood, where cotton no longer grows because the land was never allowed to heal, where blood soaked into earth that hasn't forgotten, the wind still carries echoes of 300 people running towards something they'd been told they could never have. Their names are mostly lost to history, their stories fragmented and incomplete, but their courage, their desperate, beautiful, terrible courage, remains. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when hope seems impossible, even when the weight of injustice crushes down like a physical force, people will rise, people will fight, people will run toward freedom, even if they never quite reach it, because the running itself is an act of defiance, and that defiance echoes through generations. If this story moved you, leave your like and follow the channel for more incredible stories from the past, mysteries and hidden secrets that only here you'll find.